to win the competition, I restored the Armory. You can see this a very impressive neoclassic Armory, which was always a military museum. Actually, it was completely devastated by East Germans. The front elevation was completely distorted. There was a front pediment was taken away. The columns were taken away. I restored it back to its kind of authentic sense of what it was. And then I created a kind of a very unexpected form, which this is a plan. It's a model. But if you go to the next one, you can see it here from the air. It's a wedge, three-dimensional wedge that cuts into the building very violently. Now, this is not a museum of just weapons. This is no longer a museum. This is a museum which asks the questions: why people participate in organized violence? Why are there wars? Why was Germany at the forefront of so many conflicts in the 19th and 20th century? And what is the future of a Germany as a democracy? And that's what I wanted to do. I did not want to hide the German military behind old walls. I wanted to expose the importance of a military institution and democracy to the public. And I created this wedge, and just to tell you a little bit why it's facing away from the central axis, slightly off, because it is pointing really to the triangle from which Dresden was bombed in those Allied bombings. So, of course, there's the museum itself restored in a very strong way back. But when you get up to the upper levels and you go through the building, which has very dramatic exhibits of the V2 rockets, of all that has gone into the military, at the end you really wind up in this view of Dresden. And you have, on one hand, you have the view of Dresden, which is a rebuilt city completely. It was devastated, but it's a beautiful city, rebuilt. But at the same time, the wedge is pointing to the triangular form and the point which was used by the Allied bombers to destroy Dresden itself. So you are simultaneously both outside, projected beyond the building into the future, but also into the past of this city. And that's part, I think, of what it is to deal with history and to educate, because this building is also, of course, where German soldiers get to see German military history from the 13th century. It's a long and complicated and tragic history as well, but a history with a hope and with a future, and the importance, of course, of Germany in modern Europe, in the world, in NATO. It's clearly something that we should not take for granted. Politics. It's often used pejoratively in architecture, but I believe that all architecture is political. Not just the juries that choose projects are political. Not just the people behind the scenes who are political, but architecture itself is part of the city, is the politeia. And I do believe that that's really the function of buildings as well. I went back to my childhood because I grew up in Poland, born in Poland. I lived there till I was 11, 12 years old. I speak the language. And I was often with my parents in Warsaw. My mother is from Warsaw. I lived in Łódź. And I had a chance to build an apartment building, the tallest residential tower in Europe, actually, Zlota 44, right across the Palace of Culture. And of course, this palace was built to oppress the Poles, the Polish people, by Stalin. Now, times have changed. Poland is resurrected. And I find it particularly meaningful to be able to be building a building that soars and represents really everyday life. It's not a palace of culture. It's for people to live, to activate the streets. And it's very poignant because my mother's well-known Hasidic family lived just on those streets which have been devastated in the bombing and the reconstruction of Warsaw and Poland. Music is a very important part of my life. I spent much of my life also as a musician. And I think music is not just a metaphor. It's true that if you think about it, and we have one of the most famous doctors in the world sitting right here, Dr. Zev Rothstein, the sense of orientation is the inner ear. And that's where music also addresses us and space. And I had a good occasion to, in a competition, to build on the old docklands in Dublin. I know Dublin is going through, Ireland is going through a difficult time, but this hall, which was built as part of private-public partnership, really has created a cultural institution. This is, a hall for 2,500 people, where you can stand on the stage, as you see here at the beginning, with no microphone. So I'm very proud of the acoustics and proud to create a building that has really given Dublin what it has always had, the great voices, the great poetic tradition of a great city, and bring life back to the Docklands. Again, a building that is very efficient, minimizes the lobbies, minimizes the public space, but creates something that is kind of like a transparent curtain to take you into the magic of performances. Of course, diversity is key. Diversity not just of different people, but different kinds of architecture, different kinds of ideas. As a master planner and an architect of the City Life project in the center of Milan, this is where all the fairgrounds, old fairgrounds used to be there. They moved out to the suburbs. I was able to win the competition to master plan, to create a new park in the center of Milan. You know, my daughter, youngest daughter Rachel, was born in Milan. I lived in Milan. It's a beautiful city, but a city that needs also, like all cities, to transform itself, to get out of its bourgeois mode and create high-rise buildings, create new residential quarters. So I'm building a large site. It's including very dramatic high-density housing with sort of spectacular places to live, and also a museum of contemporary art. And it's not just a nice form, because I believe nice forms don't really work in the long run. It's a form based on an emotional and intellectual idea of Leonardo da Vinci, who always considered the human figure as part of a circle and a square, that you can inscribe the human figure simultaneously in a circle and a square. But I shifted that square of Leonardo, because I think had he lived today, he had it in the center anymore. So it's a museum, of course, that is part of my project. And you can see the 3 skyscrapers, 2 other architects, my own building here, the piazza, the large park. And certainly it is also to say that even historically great cities like Milan, who have traditions, very strong traditions, also need the impetus to change themselves, because without change, I think there is no life, and that change has to be connected to the texture of life, scale of life that was there before, and also can grow in new directions. Of course, I come to a very important thing to me, because I believe that you cannot have good architecture if you have dictators dictating it, or monarchs or kings. Even if it looks beautiful, in the long run, it's just a hollow thing. So democracy is not just a pretty phrase, a cliche that we can mouth. It's how to open architecture to the true public. And I really, I have to say, I'm involved in a project that was extremely public, is extremely public. And I have to tell you a very interesting story, because very often I'm asked, where was I on 9/11, 2001? You know, everybody wants to know, where was I? And I tell you, after working for 13 years on the Jewish Museum, which I showed you earlier, I went to the office that day, to my studio. It was September 11, 2001. It was the opening day of the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And I said to my colleagues, to Nina, I'm so happy. Thank you, Seth. I said, I'm so happy I don't have to think about history today, because people can enter the building of the Jewish Museum. They can see that history for themselves. The museum opened its doors at 10 o'clock, September 11, 2001, closed its doors at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 2:30, when, of course, the attacks happened on New York. There was such uncertainty. And I suddenly realized there is a connection between everything. Things that don't appear connected are connected. And at that moment, I turned to Nina and I said, I want to return to Lower Manhattan. Little did I know that I'd be lucky enough to win the competition for what I call the Memory Foundations, which is how to rebuild ground zero. And I just want to say that this is not a very obvious project, because at that time the mayor of New York wanted only low buildings, 2-story buildings. There was a large group that wanted to rebuild the 2 towers exactly as they were. There was much diversity in opinion. Well, when I came, I proposed this project because I believed that this project isn't just dealing with the obvious stakeholders. There are many stakeholders. There are families of the victims. That's where I started, those who perished. What does that mean? This is no longer just a piece of real estate. It's a spiritual space that has to be civic for the future. There is, of course, the Port Authority that owns the land and leases the land to architects, to developers and their own architects. There's, of course, the governor of the state of New York and state of New Jersey who control Port Authority. There's the mayor of New York who controls the streets of New York. There's the MTA, the subway authorities, the path train authorities. It's really the representation of the complexity of democracy, and it's not easy. I have to tell you, as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the best of all the worst possible systems. Because it's difficult. You can't just point your finger and get a bubble built or a huge thing built and everybody will applaud. It's just you have to navigate through in order to garner consensus. And let me just go back for a second here. What was important to me was, of course, to start with the site itself, not to build on it. 16-acre site, 10 million square feet of office spaces, 5 million square feet of other infrastructure, 2 million square feet of cultural facilities. 16 acres, 8 acres, I decided, leave it to the public. This should be public space. My parents, who worked in the sweatshops of New York, would have never been in those glorious office buildings. They would have been in the subways. And I always thought, what would the people of New York get from this, other than the investors and those lucky enough to work just on this side? So the Statue of Liberty, the ideas of time, of history, of the bedrock, of the foundation walls were very important. And I only show this with the mayor and the governor. That's a highly political process, very emotional. It's not a project that you can do in 5 seconds. You have to stay with it. It's a marathon. That's my early sketch. That's the latest rendering with the 1776 symbolic Freedom Tower, Tower number 1. Pretty close, given how many hands are involved. So there is a division of labor, but a unity of an idea. Of course, the master plan is complex. I cannot explain it very quickly, but I did want to preserve this wall for visible public view. The Slurry Wall, which is a huge foundation wall, which we should have never seen. It goes 75 feet to the street level. I thought people should see that. That should not be just covered up. Very difficult to expose a foundation because foundations are meant to be built on top. So to expose a foundation, a major architectural idea, and I was lucky that the engineers of the Port Authority and others agreed with me, and we are able to have this wall at the center of the museum. The museum will open, by the way, next year. It will be really a visceral experience that you cannot get from TV, from images, because you have to descend into this low point and experience the spirit where people perish and also where life comes from. That's the bedrock, that's the foundations of that site. And of course, the memorial has opened. You know, when I first proposed, Michael Arad is the designer of the memorial, when I first proposed waterfalls, which I proposed in the competition, it was very controversial. The Post, the New York people said, you know, crazy to have waterfalls in the middle of Lower Manhattan. It's an insane idea. You know, how can you have Niagara Falls in the middle? I insist on it because it's very important to bring life through water. The sound of water screens the loud noises of Lower Manhattan and gives an intimacy, I think. And I think those of you who will have been or will be in the memorial, I think you will see that it's something that really works, something that is beautiful, something that is, and you see the visitor building center, which is now being completed, which will take you down into the bowels of New York, where you will experience. And of course, another aspect of that's the entrance from really the east side of the site. And I created an extra public space. You know, there's never enough space in New York. The small streets of Wall Street with the shadows. You know, it's important to change that. And so I created what I call the wedge of light. It's a plaza which is determined by 2 times of the attack. 8:46 when the first tower was struck, and 10:28 when the second tower collapsed. The central line of that oval, which is the station of Calatrava. So people will experience this light, even not on a September 11th. They will experience the shift of light as they enter one of the busiest parts of Manhattan. And of course, very important to me, it was to organize the buildings. They're large-scale buildings. Even tower number 2 is bigger than the Empire State Building, just to give you the reference here. To organize them as a sculptural setting, as a crown, as a kind of torch of liberty, which will leave the site really empty, open, without shadows, with as much air and light as possible. And I think that's very important. And again, early rendering, you know, in the competition, just the massing, the symbolic, the descent of the towers, the open area, the cultural nexus, the street going through. And that's indeed what is being built. Of course, there are many aspects. People always ask me, when is it finished? You know, it's progressive. The museum will open next year. The September 11th, last year, we had the memorial opening. Tower number 1, Freedom Tower, will probably be finished next year. Tower number 4 is reaching completion. Tower number 3 is already visible over the ground. Infrastructure is being built. The PATH terminal will open probably in 3 years. Again, it's a work in progress. It's part of the hubbub of the city. This is already an older photograph from my window, from my studio in New York, but you can see that a lot is happening, and it is a kind of resurrection of Manhattan again, because it was such a devastating blow. And I always think that life is victorious over these events, over these evil deeds. And you know, I show you this because it's my last picture. It's where I started. You know, as an immigrant to New York, I was lucky to arrive by ship, by the Statue of Liberty. And it's just like in the movies. I kid you not. It's not a sentimental sort of hyperbole. I was woken up. My mother woke us up. My sister and I. We stood on the deck of the ship at 5 o'clock in the morning, 4:30. SS Constitution, America Holland Line, as it steered into the harbors of New York. And the power of liberty, of what it means to immigrants, to other people who have been dispossessed, who are poor, who have no opportunities, and the proof of liberty and its justice is in the skyline of New York. As difficult as New York is, and believe me, it's difficult, and as controversial and as hard it is, and how much a struggle it is, New York is the proof of liberty, and that's what Ground Zero is as well. So now let me go to why I'm really here. Next one, please. Healing, because it is a story of healing, and you will hear from the true expert here. But I believe that architecture can contribute to something, to the human being that has to do also with buildings. And I was lucky enough to work with Zev and many others on the Pediatrics Neuroscience Center for kids, for illnesses that need to be addressed. And I thought of, actually I had a crazy thought of the guardians of the tree of life. You know, if you read the biblical text, and particularly the many commentaries, I thought of this wing ascending, because of course, as you will hear, the hospital is a city built by Zev. It's a whole city, Tel HaShomer, and it's an incredible place. And so everything has to do with the existing. And this building sits on an existing base. It's connected to the infrastructure of the hospital. Of course, there's many facilities for children, the kindergartens, the different medical spaces that are needed, research spaces, educational spaces, places for families. But again, it is itself a gateway to the entire complex of Tel HaShomer, which is such an incredible and inspiring work. And of course, the Sheba Medical Center, post-traumatic stress center. And I have to